Good morning and welcome this is our first event in person and via Zoom in our new offices using our new technology. So we are fingers crossed that it will work. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute here in Philadelphia. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. And today we have an event looking at strategic competition. And our host today is Nikolas Gvosdev, who is, I'm blocking him behind me, who is our editor of Orbis and a Eurasia senior fellow in our Eurasia program. He's also a professor at the Naval War College up in Newport and is down here in Philadelphia for the day for this program. So before I turn the reins over to Nick to make the introductions, I'd like to ask you all to at the end of this, especially those of you online, to fill out a feedback form for us. We're very anxious to know what you think of this program so that we can, and we do read every one of those. As some of you know, I respond to you sometimes when you send us your feedback because we take it very seriously. And also before I turn this over, to also thank those of you who are members and donors. Not in one of those categories, I encourage you to become and join one of those categories, because these events are free to you, but they're not free to us, as I'm very fond of saying. Finally, we will be taking your questions at the end. Those of you in person can just raise your hand. For those of you watching online, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can put your questions in that box. So without further ado, Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll go ahead and take the hard copies since they're right here. Welcome, as Raleigh said, our first event in person and online hybrid in the new space. Also restarting what I hope will be a consistent part of FPRI programming, which is to better integrate what appears in the journal, in our journal Orbis, with what is happening at the Institute. And so I'm very pleased to have two authors of recent essays that appeared in Orbis. And those of you that are here have the hard copy. Those of you online, and everyone who has sent the invitation, the links are open. So if you're not here and you'd like copies of the articles, click on the links and you will be able to be taken to Asha, Castleberry-Hernandez's and Wyne's pieces. And I wanted to set up our discussion because their pieces are interesting and also very timely, particularly yours, Asha. And the bios, of course, are in the pieces and then online, but I want to go straight into the conversation. And just to frame to both of you to start and to get your reaction. So you wrote for us last year on China's increasing role in the Middle East. And of course, this was before the somewhat surprise announcement of the Chinese brokering the restoration of diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But again, clearly that China is playing much more of a role in a part of the world that the United States assumed it was always going to more or less be the dominant outside arbiter. And that has some real implications for, we think about going to the Indo-Pacific and what does it mean for China to be coming, as you put it, not just simply to the Middle East, but to North Africa, that is coming to the Persian Gulf and then to the Mediterranean. And so framing this, are we moving towards a truly global strategic competition where it's no longer just the US thinking about the Pacific Basin, but in fact that this is taking place globally. And then Ali's piece for the spring, for the spring issue spring last year, which was assessing these competitive pressures from China and from Russia. How should US view this, not to necessarily overreact, and what exactly are we looking for in any type of strategic competition with Russia and with China. And so with that, both pieces, I think, were ahead of their time based on where we are today, what's happening in the Middle East, what we've seen over the past number of months, whether it's the U.S. attempting to decouple from China, the President Macron's visit to China, which certainly rattled some feathers in Washington because of his comments both about Europe not decoupling from China and seeking a strategic autonomy from the United States. So maybe just to ask you both to kind of just where are we today? What are you seeing? What do you think we should be paying attention to?
Oh, you go first.
Oh, I was going to say, okay. I was going to say you should go first. Well, first, Nick, wonderful to be with you. Asha and Asha, wonderful to be with you. We were just talking a few minutes ago. I think the last time the three of us were together in person, it was in New York, I think in 2018. So it's been 5 years. Well, maybe just I don't want to encroach on Asha's turf too much because Asha, I defer to Asha on this point. But since you did mention the normalization deal that China brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia, just I think one interesting point for me is that I think up until quite recently, one of the narratives about China had been that it had been able to exercise growing geopolitical influence in spite of its diplomacy. So we've heard a lot about China's so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, how China had alienated a lot of advanced industrial democracies. And one of the narratives about China had been that because of its growing economic heft, because of its growing technological capacity, that it would be able to, if not fully override or mitigate strategic distrust that it was engendering, that it would be able to push back against it somewhat just by virtue, again, of its geoeconomic heft. I think that what we're seeing in the first few months of this year is that China is emerging into a more fulsome competitor, into a more multidimensional competitor, in large part because of its increasing diplomatic efforts, not in spite of them. And so you look at China's 12-point peace plan for Russia and Ukraine. Now, it's elicited a very lukewarm reception in Europe, but if this war between Russia and Ukraine grinds on indefinitely, if more and more countries outside of Europe demonstrate receptiveness to that proposal, it could potentially begin to elicit more support in and beyond Europe. Obviously, the normalization deal that you mentioned, later this year, China will be hosting officials from the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, as well as Iran. And so I think that what we're seeing now, and then maybe would love to get Asha's thoughts, is yes, China's economic role is growing. Yes, its military power is growing. But I think that what we're seeing in addition is China is now casting itself increasingly as not just an economic player, not just as a military player, but potentially as a diplomatic competitor as well. So to the extent that China can credibly, and it's obviously it has a lot of strategic distrust to override, but to the extent that China can cast itself as being an economic power, a military power, and increasingly as a peacemaker, as a diplomatic player, it becomes a much more fulsome competitor. But this is Asha's turf, not mine. So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts.
You articulated really well. Thank you so much, everyone, for allowing me to be here, Nick, and Foreign Policy Research Institute, Orbis. This is really great. So yes, this is such a relevant question as far as applying to Ali and definitely my portfolio in terms of China's position in the Middle East between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So just a quick background of it, coming into the administration. And by the way, put my disclaimer here, I represent myself, not the US government. So it's Army, State Department, et cetera, et cetera. When the first NSS first came out, it was mentioned that strategic competition is going to intensify in the next 10 years. And then when looking at the findings or the outcomes going across the international system, we see that applies differently. But then also too, as far as USG's priorities, definitely Indo-Pacific, Europe, and I would rank Middle East, North Africa behind those two. So as part of my portfolio in the State Department, going in January 2021, where we're dealing with so many multiple crises, I would say that China was definitely gaining a lot of ground for day one in the Middle East, North Africa. And but again, it varied across the region where you saw the intensity more in UAE versus Israel, looking at Bahrain versus you looking at Iraq, it varied across. But as far as Chinese activities, just as you mentioned before, they definitely wanted to seek dominance in terms of economics and technology. But then we start to see some sort of security interests, right? Militarily, in terms of military installations, going beyond Djibouti and trying to go beyond and expand those interests in the Gulf, and also playing this peacemaker as well. So the first indication that we encountered was China trying to be this peacemaker between Israel and Palestine. And it did not work out over time, to where they leaned more towards the Palestinians, and Israel was deeply upset and went back to the UN and said, look, we condemn China for the weaker issue, right? Prior to that, they did not do that. Then we saw, them posturing a little bit more as somewhat of a peacekeeper when it comes to the Iran deal. They will go back and forth between favoring the United States and then sometimes going against, favoring Iran. And then when we saw this 25-year relationship between Iran and China, we were like, okay, what comes along with this? And some of it was opaque, but some of it involved being some sort of peacemaker deal in the region. So based on those two indications, I'm not surprised that China is now trying to play this peacemaker role between Iran and Saudi. If you've been paying attention within the last 2 years, how they've been just test driving and these different type of regional security, international peace and security issues where they were posturing themselves. It was, if you lean in more on your strategic predictability, you would see that they wanted to definitely play a part between Saudi and Iran.
I wanted to pick up further on that, Asha, and then a point that you raised in your piece, which I think has become even more important since you wrote it. And that is, in popular thinking, right, the idea has been that the US is leaving the Middle East, where we get out of Afghanistan, we get out of Iraq, we're pivoting away. And yet you make a critical point, which is that the Middle East set of countries are a keystone link between the Euro-Atlantic world and the Indo-Pacific. And another forthcoming Orbis author, Mohammed Solomon, has coined this term, the Indo-Abrahamic corridor. From India to the Gulf to the Middle East is this belt of critical countries. Do you think that the US is postured to really engage in that, or are you worried that we have ceded too much ground perhaps to China over the last number of years, that the idea that the US is withdrawing, we're distracted, we're focused elsewhere? Is there a sense that the Middle East, in fact, returns not for some of the traditional reasons that the Middle East mattered to the US, but for the future of this idea that we have these two centers of gravity in the world, the Euro-Atlantic, Indo-Pacific, and Middle East, North Africa becomes this important bridge between the two?
Thank you for asking the question. So let's be honest here. For the last 20 years, we've been engaging with the Middle East on security. Security is the main domain that we've been working on, whether it's, the Iraq war, counterterrorism, building up our military presence for quite some time. Security has been the main domain in driving our relationship between us and our Middle East allies and partners. So to shift away from that, where they're seeing a downsize in our military posture, where we're removing key capabilities like Patriots missiles from the region, it's a cultural shock after 20 years of investing in the security domain. So our near peer competitors definitely took advantage of that, oh yeah, they're leaving, they're withdrawing, they no longer are interested in you, they're more interested in Indo-Pacific and Europe. So it was believable, especially for the fact that you've seen a significant change in our global posture. So going in the first half of the administration, the global posture review was the one that set the tone as far as, okay, we're changing around our priorities here. Now, after 21 plus years of investing so much into the security domain, pouring so much dollars into ensuring that we build up our security alliances with our partners in the Middle East. Again, it's a cultural shock, but we're not necessarily leaving the region. We're just shifting our priorities where we want to invest more into soft power than hard power. So that's what you're seeing right now as far as the shift, the transition, where we want to invest more with our partners and allies in the region when it comes to economics, technology, and that's where all the stuff that Mohammed Salman talks about. Also with renewable energy, that's why President Biden appointed a special envoy Kerry, where he constantly engaged with the Saudis, the Emiratis on renewable energy, renewable energy ties that also included with a lot of innovation, new ideas on what we could do with them. So it's this shift that we're experiencing now. Now, will it take a while? Well, is China trying to replace the United States when it comes to being the #1 security partner? I don't think so right now. And I don't think they're capable of doing so, especially for the fact that they have not met all the objectives in East Asia, especially when it comes to Taiwan and the ASEAN issues there. So I don't think so, but they do have growing interest overall. Now, going back to shifting our priorities to the soft power, the soft issues, that's where it comes into the alliances where we've been trying to build on new alliances, investing more beyond the Abraham Accords on what we could do together when it comes to renewable energy, technology, build on this Indo-Pacific, Middle East, transatlantic alliance on how we can do that all together. So as part of the administration's strategic interest is to build on new alliances so we can meet those type of objectives.
Yeah, I think that's it's a robust vision that's there. But then, so this actually allows me to pivot to Ali and to ask from your piece, you concluded with, and Asha talked a bit about global posture review, that we have to evaluate our commitments, where are we going to be? You ended your essay with a note that, the United States has to be able to decide when, where, and how to compete. And there are different types of competition: economic, technological, not just military. Do you have a sense that we have a calculus yet? That we have a calculus of competition that allows us to say, we will compete here, we will concede here, we will ignore here, or are we still largely reactive? That is, something happens, squirrel, you run off, and then the next squirrel comes in. So, because I think Asha's vision that she's laid out here of where the administration would like to go, which is we have these group of partners and we really invest in that. But do you see from your analytic perch that we have a calculus that's informing how we're doing this?
So, I mean, it won't surprise me, and I agree with everything that Asha said. I think that there still is a desire to prioritize the Indo-Pacific. And if you look at the administration came in, it releases an interim national security strategic guidance document, I think in March of 2021. And it expresses not a preference, but it articulates a desire to prioritize the Indo-Pacific. Then there's the release of the Indo-Pacific strategy in February of 2022, underscoring that the United States regards the Indo-Pacific as being the central geographic and strategic theater for American competitiveness. The national security strategy reinforces that message. So I think that there is a desire to prioritize the Indo-Pacific. And I think I want to note, and Asha was getting at this point, the desire to focus on the Indo-Pacific, or I think what used to be called in older parlance, the Asia-Pacific, the desire to prioritize Asia it's a longstanding desire. It's a bipartisan desire. It's little remarked, and I actually didn't realize until recently, when we think, it actually goes back to the George W. Bush administration. So even though the George W. Bush administration is known for sort of its foreign policy after September 11th, its focus on counterterrorism, prior to 9/11, when the administration came into office, it actually was focusing on how do we reorient U.S. foreign policy towards Asia. Then, of course, 9/11 happened. Every administration since the George W. Bush administration has wanted to focus more on Asia, only to be buffeted by crises outside of Asia. I think that this administration, what has been unique is that the administration has managed to not only continue its prioritization of the Indo-Pacific, but I would argue it's actually counterintuitively has been able to intensify its focus on the Indo-Pacific despite Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, what Russia's invasion of Ukraine did was, it was a shock to the system, not only in Europe, it was also a real wake-up call for America's allies and partners in Asia. Had it not been for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's not clear to me that Australia, India, Japan, South Korea, and other allies and partners in Asia would be recalibrating their defense postures in the way that they are. It's not clear to me that they would be deepening their interoperability in the way that they are. So I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's not only been sort of a jolt for, say, NATO, for the transatlantic alliance, I think it's also been a real sort of a boost for the Quad, the quadrilateral security dialogue. So I think that just, to summarize, I would say the administration still wants to focus on the Indo-Pacific, and I think it wants to demonstrate that despite Russia's invasion of Ukraine, despite ongoing instability in the Middle East, that it's going to maintain that focus. But obviously, as crises continue to proliferate, as tensions continue to brew, it becomes difficult to maintain that focus. So if the Russia-Ukraine war grinds on indefinitely, do we begin to have more of a robust conversation about trade-offs between Europe and the Indo-Pacific? If crises brew in the Middle East, as they do and as they have, what are the trade-offs involved? I'll just conclude by saying that one essay that I often find myself revisiting again and again, it was an essay that was published in the 1950s called "The Illusion of American Omnipotence." And it's basically the upshot of the piece is that, yes, the United States is the world's foremost power. It remains today the world's foremost power. But preponderance is not the same thing as omnipotence. And just because you are the world's foremost power doesn't mean that you don't have to make trade-offs. It doesn't mean that you don't have to engage in very difficult strategic calculations. And if you attempt to prioritize every region equally, then you end up not having priorities at all. And so I think that what America's preeminence allows it to do is it allows it perhaps to postpone those trade-offs for longer than virtually every other power in the international system. But I think that trade-offs are inevitable. Trade-offs help to discipline your foreign policy. Trade-offs are not going to make everyone happy because everyone is advocating to focus more on this region or that region. So I think that we will continue to see a desire to prioritize the Indo-Pacific. I think that as the Russia-Ukraine war grinds on, as various crises proliferate in the Middle East, you'll have more and more critics who say that, look, the desire to pivot or rebalance, it's always been a fantasy. It remains a fantasy. You have to be sort of more equally engaged across the world. But I think that this tension between an Indo-Pacific focused foreign policy and a foreign policy that's more strategically distributed in Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific, that debate will continue to rage.
And I think what we've seen in Washington over the past sort of 7 months has become noticeable, which is, as you said, this debate is intensifying about priorities, and you're now getting the sense of, all right, Ukraine has gotten enough, it's gotten what we can spare, and now we need to pivot back. And I think that's something that will continue, partly because, I mean, the Russia-Ukraine, the Russians have been able to sustain their invasion of Ukraine longer than I think the Biden administration and many people in Washington assumed that they could, and that now is opening the doorway. Ali mentioned one thing about interoperability, and I kind of, if I'm don't want to put you on the spot, but with your own military background, a sense, and certainly in the Middle East, that's been a big issue of we train and equip forces. Are we moving towards a situation where, getting back to, as you laid out, this idea of a transatlantic Middle East Indo-Pacific, not only as an economic corridor, but is it a goal also that we would want forces that are interoperable with the U.S. and potentially with each other? That would not be out of the realm of possibility that a French and Australian and Japanese and UAE units could all at some point function together. So.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you so much for bringing that up, because I just came from Iraq a couple of weeks ago, and there was that big question on that as far as our future relationship with the Iraqis and the Kurds in Syria, and how do we deal with Turkey moving forward, and what's our security cooperation relationship look like moving forward now that we are prioritizing. We have other priorities when it comes to our foreign policy. So there is an interest to kind of bring this all together, because we know our alliance system is being more challenged. So in terms of like looking at NATO, right about now, there's a lot of discussion on how do we deal with a future China involving NATO. Right about now, the US ambassador to NATO she talks a lot about how do we prep in terms of dealing with China and kind of looking at the alignment between China and Russia. And how can NATO go beyond just worrying about, countering Russian aggression and work with other allies and partners on how to meet the objective of effectively countering Russia and China. So there is an interest, there's a thirst for it. But we also have some challenges when it comes to meeting those objectives. Like, for instance, at the end of the day, NATO doesn't need to work on effectively countering Russia, right? So if you look at them trying to also look at China at the same time, are we overwhelming NATO? And that's the big question for our other allies and partners. They have their own little security objectives that they need to meet. And then when you tell them to expand on it, it's challenging for them at times. And it's also challenging too, because with regards to China being that economic partner, there's some hesitation that should we also join with our other allies and partners as far as countering China in terms of their security interests, because that economic relationship is what is impacting their mindsets of, I don't know if I want to do this. You're seeing that among some of our NATO partners. You're seeing that amongst some of our partners outside of NATO. So yes, there's this dream that we want to bring everyone together to counter China, but then those economic, technological agreements, ties, et cetera, deals is what is undermining us to meet that objective.
Ali, maybe can I jump in about, I know you've commented on the difference between decoupling and de-risking.
Yeah.
And that, that perspective, because I think that touches directly on what Asha has said, that, that some of the countries, they don't want to decouple from China. They might want to de-risk. And so maybe, building on what her observations there.
Sure. I mean, and again, what Asha said, I completely agree. And it segues into what I wanted to say, which is, so if you look at sort of 30,000 foot level, kind of bird's eye view, there is broadly among advanced industrial democracies, there's, I think, a broadly sort of shared direction of travel. You see, Asian allies and partners, European allies and partners increasingly, coalescing to think of ways to push back against, Chinese influence. But if you come down to a more granular level, sort of closer to the ground, differences begin to emerge between allies and partners. And we were having a conversation just a few minutes ago before starting. I like to think that the United States, when it thinks about its allies and partners vis-a-vis China, it kind of has a two-tier structure of cooperation. I think that the first tier, its Asian allies and partners, I think, are much more openly aligned with US efforts. So if you look at Australia, India, Japan, South Korea, I think that they're much more openly aligned with US efforts. There's a little bit more reticence when it comes to our European allies and partners. If you look at France, you look at President Macron's recent visit to Beijing, his comments to Politico. If you look at Charles Michel, for that matter, Charles Michel is saying that there are a number of other leaders in Europe who probably share President Macron's views. And we see this, so I think that there's a little bit more reticence in Europe, and it manifests in this notion that you discussed, this distinction between decoupling and de-risking. I think that decoupling, at least when I think of decoupling, there's a real sense of disentangling yourself in a much more structural, enduring way, particularly in high tech, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, and the like. Whereas I think that Europe, because of its extant investments in China, because of its extant economic relationships with China, there's much more of a reluctance. And in some cases, we actually see not only do European allies and partners not want to go along with the United States as much when it comes to disentanglement technologically, but in some cases, they actually want to double down. You look at Volkswagen, it wants to double down on its investments in China. So I think that what we're likely to see vis-a-vis China, I don't think that we're going to see a unified coalition of advanced industrial democracies that proceeds on the same timeline, with the same sense of urgency, with the same set of priorities. What we're going to see instead, and this is what Jake Sullivan talks a lot about, this notion of a latticework of partnership, this notion that you're going to have issue-specific coalitions of allies and partners that are working on so AUKUS, the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. You're going to have sort of this kind of patchwork or latticework of alliances and partnerships contesting China on different issues in different ways. But I don't think that we're going to have a uniform coalition. And so the question is, one, how do you leverage that latticework to maximum effect, number one, and number two, what do we envision with Russia, but also with China, what do we envision as a kind of a durable modus vivendi? I think, and Asha and I have had this conversation, and so have you and I, Nick. China and Russia, for all of their frailties at home and abroad, I think that they are likely to endure in one form or another. I don't think that they're going to collapse. I don't think that they're going to go away. And so the real question for us is, if we accept the hypothesis that China and Russia are likely to endure for all of their weaknesses at home and abroad, the question for the United States, its allies and partners becomes not how do you pursue a decisive victory, how do you achieve a decisive victory, and I don't even really know what victory would mean vis-a-vis China and Russia, but how do you pursue a sustainable modus vivendi? And I think that that latter undertaking is going to require a kind of diplomacy, a vocabulary, a mindset that we really haven't cultivated or inculcated sufficiently, but we'll have to do so going forward.
Just your point about Latticework, I just want to call attention to the next issue of Orbis. We're going to have Jada Frazier talking about minilateralism, that the US needs to become much more comfortable with, as you said, this latticework of different partnerships and coalitions that can't all be glommed into one overarching issue. And just, Asha, when you were talking earlier about NATO, and of course, we saw 20 years ago the resistance to global NATO, right? Which we said, well, NATO should go to the world, and a number of our NATO allies said not interested. Well, just to let people online start queuing up, if you haven't already, your questions and comments, and we'll take those as they come in. But one last point, and Ali raised this about technology, and I couldn't, and you've already mentioned, the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. It really does seem that, the Middle East, and particularly Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, both as they want more of this, and they're in a position to help finance some of these developments. So is that, when we talk about competition, is there going to be a competition, not among states, well, states perhaps, but even more among companies, seeking to, to build NEOM, to then really, transform the Middle East? So is that another area of strategic competition, which is the technological one? And is the Middle East going to become one of those?
Oh, thank you for bringing that up, because part of our work was to, what do we do with the private sector? Because in some ways, some of our companies are not aligned with strategic competition or views on how to move forward. And it takes a lot of making sure, in order to achieve that alignment, constantly educating the private sector on this is what's going on, this is our recommendation, but being very careful about it because of laissez-faire, right? So we have a lot of companies throughout the world, US companies that are there in country, engage with the outcomes of strategic competition, and they see that, oh, we're in more of a competitive state when it comes to technology, economic deals and ties. And then some of them already have their own deals and ties with the PRC. So it's it get really complicated. But at the end of the day, it's very important that the public and private sector do build up this alignment where they're on the same page when it comes to strategic competition. And I would say that it's very important that Congress, which you would be surprised I say this, has a growing bipartisan spirit when it comes to China overall. They just built out the Chinese China panel to discuss on how do we move forward with involving strategic competition. So and as a result of that, that's what helped us pass the CHIPS Act, where we are now investing more in commercial diplomacy, investing a lot in the the Department of Commerce, ensuring that we are building out our semiconductors and competing in that aspect, and making sure that we work closely with IBM and other tech companies with regards to all this, what we're trying to do here. But it's very important, not only you speak to CEOs of these private companies, but the people on ground that are, part of these companies are aligned with us and working very closely with our embassies to ensure that we can find opportunities and compete effectively overall. And another point I want to say that's very important too is that China, it brings in its own rules of engagement, on its own ways of how they deal with our partners and allies. Some of those rules are not to our partners and allies' advantage. It puts them at a disadvantage. It builds up this sense of dominance at times. So it's very important that our private sector understands the intent behind it. Now, it can get a little messy. Sometimes they say, oh, you're just, excuse my French, you're hating. This is not really real, or we don't really believe it. Or they see the outcomes of this and they go, okay, we understand. So it's kind of messy, but it's the most important part is staying engaged and ensuring that we're working very closely with the private sector on this in order to win. Because at the end of the day, if we don't stay engaged with them and we don't educate them what is going on, it impacts our deliverables, because in strategic competition, deliverables matter at the end of the day. And if we don't deliver, it's not gonna work for us.
And thank you just for mentioning the role of, my former governor, now Secretary of Commerce, because I think that is something we're going to have to get used to in the future, that when we think of foreign policy and national security, it's not just the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, but the Secretary of Commerce, as well as the Secretary of the Treasury, are going to be as, if in some cases, not more critical. We have about 20 minutes, so I'd like to open the floor, and if we have any question, Kayla, I guess we have a question queued up online.
Yes, we have a question from an online attendee that says, do you think that the recent peace deal brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia by China would affect the US's ties with Saudi Arabia? And how would this peace deal affect the US's interest in the Gulf?
Thank you for the question. Yes, of course. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No.
Oh.
Go ahead. I'm just letting.
Oh. Yes, of course. This will definitely impact the relationship with the United States. But again, going back to the word deliverable, the outcome of this agreement. If China wants to be the deal broker between Iran and Saudi Arabia, to where they can ensure that Iran will relinquish all of its malign activities throughout the region with regards to Hezbollah, right, in Lebanon, Hamas, as well as the Houthis in Yemen, and as well as their activities going on in Iraq. Go right ahead. Let's see if you can really get Iran to relinquish its activities. That's a lot of work. But again, going back to the relationship, of course, it's going to shape the relationship, but again, when it comes to the PRC has to deliver when it comes to this agreement. If not, the agreement is just, just on paper, and then we've come across a couple of these situations in the Middle East, especially where there are agreements between the PRC and our allies and partners, but nothing really comes out at times. Sometimes the agreements are halfway done, they're unfinished. We had one of our partners who was involved in a BRI program. They built a bridge out and they stopped, and it's been like that for a long time. So it's all about the deliverable when it comes to this agreement.
Bridge to nowhere. Ellie, you have a thought? Yeah, in the back, please. Yeah.
Well, sort of my question cues up along the same lines. It's been 50 years since OPEC's first oil embargo. And for 40 of those 50 years, the US was the Middle East's largest customer in terms of buying oil and petroleum. For the past 10 years, it's gone from being its largest customer to really not being a meaningful customer for the Middle East. And today, China is the Middle East's largest customer for oil and petroleum products. So, viewed from the Saudis' perspective, the U.S., which there was a certain mutuality for 40 of the 50 years, because while they were dependent on their customer, we were dependent on them as the supplier. The U.S. is now a sort of free agent from their perspective, and in that respect, the Chinese are much more important because they're their largest customer, and Asia, broadly speaking, is. China has an interest in, being a little bit of a broker between Iran and potentially Iraq and Saudi, because as the largest buyer of petroleum from the Middle East, they want to have some leverage. So my question is, and queuing to the issue of deliverables, they're in a position to offer economic deliverables that the US formerly was, but isn't really anymore. How does that, or does that factor into US policy?
It does, with regards to the energy ties, that's probably the number one domain that shapes the relationship with China in the Middle East as well as United States. But the United States administration is extremely clear about where they're investing more in renewable energy and less on oil supply. So, again, there's this shift that's happening right now where, yes, that trade-off where we are no longer investing one, but we're investing another. But looking into the renewable energy piece, that's even competitive also too as well, where China is edging in that aspect as well. So it's extremely difficult competitive domain because of the fact that China has been able to invest both and then dominate in both as well too. But again, as mentioned to you before, Secretary Kerry has been really engaged in making sure we find innovative ideas on how we can reach deals on when it comes to renewable energy in the region. And then also too, going back to the economic argument that you just mentioned, yes, China does have a unique way of figuring out ways on how they can broker a deal with them in terms of economics, but we're doing the same thing. And in some ways, we're ahead of them, and in some ways, we're behind them in terms of making sure that we can find new deals. But innovation is key to this. Tapping into civil society, investing in them. There's a huge thirst for youth, women that want to start up, do tech companies and tap into innovation that the PRC is not engaged in. They're more engaged in with this when it comes to the government. So the US, especially in the administration, are really trying to tap into that network, that civil society, youth, women to be able to counter that effort. And they're doing the same thing in Africa. That was one of the proposals that Vice President Harris spoke about in Ghana and in other places in Africa.
That's kind of interesting, just to piggyback on that, the US may not be the main consumer of the current energy of choice of hydrocarbons, but that are we going to try to regain some connectivity by working with the countries of the region for the post-petroleum future? Ali, I don't know if you had any thoughts or
just one thought that I would add, and not so much on sort of on energy per se, but since you mentioned Saudi Arabia, I mean, something that I think I've been paying much more attention to just the past few months. I think a lot of others have been paying a lot more attention to is the role of whether you call them middle powers, non-aligned powers, unaligned powers. There's different nomenclature depending on who you talk to. I think that their agency in shaping whether we talk great power competition, strategic competition, but their agency is going to increase. And I think paying attention to how Saudi Arabia is operating, how India is operating, how South Africa is operating, Brazil, Turkey, we can go on and on. But you have a growing roster of, and The Economist actually just in one of its recent issues devoted a lot of print to this issue. You have a growing number of countries who they have for understandable reasons, they have very bad memories of the Cold War. We often talk about the Cold War as the long peace. I think that's a misnomer. It was the long peace in the sense that the United States and the Soviet Union, thankfully, mercifully, didn't go to nuclear war. But below that level, it was a devastating period of time. For nearly half a century, it was devastating for many countries around the world. Look at civil wars, proxy wars, genocides. It was a really, really bloody, grisly period. So many middle powers, unaligned powers, non-aligned powers, whatever your term, they have very bad memories of the Cold War, and they now want to use their growing economic weight, their growing technological heft to exercise agency, so that rather than becoming instruments of great power competition, they become shapers of it, or rather than becoming instruments of strategic competition, they become shapers of it. And I think that what we're seeing increasingly is whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Sub-Saharan Africa, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's Southeast Asia, increasingly, I think more and more countries have this realization that, hey, the United States is coming to us, China is coming to us, Russia is coming to us, and that gives them a tremendous amount of influence. It doesn't catapult them into the ranks of say the great powers, but it gives them a lot of influence. And so I think something that I think I'll be watching very closely in the months and years ahead is what strategies will these, I'll just use the term middle powers, but what strategies will these middle powers use as the United States, China, and Russia are courting them more and more actively? How do they use kind of that increasing courtship to enhance their own freedom of maneuver, not only regionally, but also globally?
It's a great topic for a future Orbis issue to devote an issue to. Kayla, we have another question queued up.
Yeah, so this one from an anonymous attendee is asking, considering the apparent skepticism from the global south regarding the Western interpretation of the causes to the start and continuation of the Ukrainian war, as well as the escalating military support to Ukraine and noticeable fractures within NATO, such as recent tensions with President Macron and Germany's deindustrialization, would you say that the Ukraine war has inadvertently contributed to a decline in the United States global leadership and to diminished credibility of the US neoliberal narrative?
I can just maybe offer just a few thoughts, and then again, really keen to hear what Asha thinks. I don't know if I hesitate to offer sort of a yes or no. I think it depends in terms of the answer. And what I mean is that it depends on which regions you're talking about, which countries you're talking about. So I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has reinvigorated the transatlantic alliance. I think it's reinvigorated NATO. I think it has reinvigorated the Quad. We were talking about that earlier. I think that I think that we've seen that the United States, its capacity to mobilize coalitions, whether to respond to aggression, whether it's leveraging the preeminent role of the US dollar, I think that the United States has demonstrated that notions that it's in terminal decline, I think, are proving once again to be premature. And I think that the United States, Asha has talked a lot about alliances and partnerships. I think we've seen that the United States in Europe and Asia has been able to reinvigorate a lot of its alliances and partnerships. Having said that, I think that we have to be candid. And the question, the questioner was getting to this. There is a divergence of perspectives on not only the causes of the war, but also on the fallout. And so take a look at disruptions to food markets and disruptions to energy markets. I think that in the West, and I happen to be sympathetic to this, I'm biased, I happen to be sympathetic to this narrative that we wouldn't have the disruptions to food markets and energy markets that we do had Russia not invaded Ukraine. Unfortunately, there is a lot of sympathy in countries in the developing world. There's a lot of sympathy for the narrative that says, well, we might not like what Russia is doing, but the West, why don't you stop imposing sanctions? Why don't you make a renewed push for negotiations? And if we were to wind up this war, then we could see some resumption of normalcy in food markets and energy markets. That narrative has a lot of traction. So when the Russian foreign minister, when Sergei Lavrov, he recently made, I think he's actually made multiple tours of sub-Saharan Africa, but when he takes tours of sub-Saharan Africa and he makes that pitch, he finds a lot of sympathetic ears. And so I think that what we are seeing, to the questioner's point, is I do think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has proven that it's demonstrated anew the United States' ability to mobilize allies and partners, to mobilize coalitions. I think that the notion that the United States is in terminal decline, I think is grossly overstated. But there are fundamental divergences of views about the causes of the war, the impact of the war. And I do think, to Asha's point about deliverables, I think it's going to be very important for the United States as it competes with China, Russia, and others for courtship in developing countries, to demonstrate that what proposals is it putting on the table to mitigate the fallout of disruptions to food and energy markets. Because if you are, for most countries in the developing world, they don't have the bandwidth. It's a luxury to be able to talk about strategic competition. It's a luxury for us here to be able to talk about great power competition. For most countries in the developing world, they don't have the bandwidth to think about those issues. They're thinking about, look, I have citizens who rightly are clamoring for clean water, low-cost energy, food, roof overhead, and they're looking for which country can deliver. To Asha's point about deliverables, and so I think that we have the luxury of contemplating strategic competition, great power competition. But for most countries in the developing world, for many of them, their view is, look, the sanctions, Western sanctions are disrupting these markets. We need to bring this war to a close, and so that divergence between how I think, broadly speaking, advanced industrial democracies think about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the fallout, and how many countries in the developing world think about that divergence is real, and I don't think it shows any sign of going away. But Asha, I mean, you've been working on these issues in a much more practical way than I'd be curious.
All these know in the conference too. You'll love them. I'll keep it very narrow. or short. The only thing I can add on, I agree with Ali, the only thing I can add on is just a smaller perspective is that when the Ukraine war happened, if you were pretty much following the developments happening in the UN, trying to get countries to support resolutions condemning Russia, it was a bit of a challenge. Why was it so challenging, right? Is that reflective of, oh, American leadership where it's declining here? Or is it more of, hey, are there some alignment when it comes to principles and values with our partners in Russia? But eventually we were able to get them to condemn Russia. But for the most part, that was a key indicator of strategic competition where why did we have to struggle, especially with countries like Kuwait, I know the Kuwait really well, where you also experienced an invasion, but you struggled with supporting, right, condemning Russia for invading Ukraine. So for the most part, I think it's a mixed bag, and but it's a more contested international system when it comes to strategic competition. And the last thing I'm gonna add on in terms of divergence of perspectives, I'm looking at the reactions of just one region, for instance, like Africa, when they keep seeing that, oh, United States is constantly giving stuff to Ukraine to support them, right? Well, when we have a crisis, we get nothing, right? So, and you started to hear that a lot, especially in the media. Now you're seeing where the administration is engaging significantly with Africa, where we have 8 of our cabinet members going to Africa after the African Leadership Summit. So you start to see where certain regions, especially Africa and somewhat Latin America, where they felt left out, where, wow, you're giving so much to Ukraine, but very little to us. So I like that how the administration was able to adjust that overall. But I think it's just mixed overall.
The last question is?
I have been trying to figure out Putin and his portion of the ruling established group in Russia, their mindset. So when you, Ali, were saying, I don't think Russia and China are going to collapse. If Putin heard that term from your lips, what's your guess as to his visceral reaction to it? Would he have felt, oh, the Soviet Union did collapse in 1989, 1990? I'm trying to understand from the little that I see, to what extent is his intelligence and his awareness genuine? To what extent can we read that? And is it like, trying to come at it from different angles. And I've thought, well, maybe you could, if you had him present, we could say, oh, we understand how you feel. It's as though the southern states, when they seceded, were allowed to go their way. But in 1893, there was a different president, and he said, this is intolerable. It was the greatest catastrophe of the 19th century. What's the level of discernment and depth to, and there's not enough time to go to Xi Jinping, but how much do these people have the capacity to really know the world and look at it in all its complexity and the nuanceness of it?
It's, we definitely don't have enough time to go in, but it's such an important question. It's such an important question. And, when we talk about Russia and China, when we talk about, what Russia wants, what China wants, and I think that your question gets to this, it's difficult to overstate the extent to which we really are talking about, the whims, the conceptions, the insecurities of one individual. In the case of Russia, Vladimir Putin; in the case of China, Xi Jinping. I read that, and I've now heard a number of sort of corroborating accounts that Putin during COVID, it's not only that he wasn't traveling much, but he spent a lot of time, according to many accounts, talking to very few people, kind of stewing in a lot of sort of a lot of kind of conspiratorial, literature and really dwelling on and really kind of feeding into his own insecurity. Putin sees himself, and I think he's made it pretty explicit, he sees himself as locked in an existential struggle, not just with the United States, but with the West more broadly. Xi Jinping had said, said very recently, he said, there is a Western coalition that seeks to contain China, and he singled out publicly, the United States. I think that it's clear from the way that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has gone that Putin was not getting it wasn't getting anywhere near the kind of intelligence, accurate intelligence that he should have been getting. Xi Jinping, I think that you have an increasingly small circle of top advisors who are giving him guidance, and that's a risk. When you have leaders presiding over very powerful countries, significant resource endowments that aren't getting good advice, the risk for miscalculation is high. I would just say one difference, though, I think it's important not to group China and Russia together. And the reason I say that is, I think that Russia is, and I made this point earlier, Russia, it's economically far smaller than China. So its economy is roughly 9 times smaller than China's. It's far less integrated. And I think that Russia feels that it can exercise influence principally by engaging in destabilizing activities. We see this with the invasion of Ukraine. We see it with election meddling. We see it with its various adventurism, various forms of adventurism in the Middle East. Russia feels that it can exercise influence via disruption, and I think it's actually much more risk-taking. China, on the other hand, it's broadly still a resurgent power. It's broadly integrated into the international system. That doesn't mean that it doesn't want to reshape certain elements of that system. But when you're deeply integrated into the system, you have a much more powerful economy, you see yourself as rising, you tend to be a little bit less risk embracing. And so I think that a critical distinction between China and Russia that should inform US foreign policy is, how do you manage a revanchist Russia whose leader feels that he has very little left to lose versus managing a resurgent China whose leader may yet believe that he has a lot left to lose by engaging in risk-taking activities.
Well, that's a great way to, we're at time, right at 12:30. It's a great way to wrap it up. I think it paves the way for a future conversation to have. I'd like to thank our guests, our Orbis authors, Asha and Ali, and just like to remind people that the conversation doesn't end at 12:30. Please continue it on particularly on our social media sites. You can follow FPRI at FPRI, and specifically for Orbis at FPRI_Orbis, where we can continue. So if you didn't get a question addressed and want to pose it, take it to Twitter. So with that, at 12:30, we'll call a close to the formal session. Thank you all for coming, and join us in a vote.